The fire glowed beneath Lars Eriksson's feet as he walked across the cabin floor in January 1842, barefoot despite the blizzard howling outside. 6 months earlier, every trapper within 20 miles had called him a fool for digging fire trenches into his foundation, but tonight, while they huddled shivering near dying hearth fires, Lars slept in warmth that radiated from stone channels burning steady beneath him. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of forgotten frontier genius move you, hit subscribe. Tomorrow's tale is even more impossible than this one. The temperature dropped to 20 degrees below zero on the night of February 9, 1841. Inside the log cabin near the Gallatin River in what would later become Montana Territory, Lars Eriksson woke to silence. The kind of silence that meant the wind had stopped, which paradoxically meant the cold had intensified beyond the point where air itself could move. He could see his breath in thick clouds despite the fire that still burned low in the stone fireplace across the single room. Lars sat up on his sleeping platform and looked toward the other side of the cabin where Thomas Whitmore slept. Thomas wasn't moving. Lars called his name. No response. He threw off his blankets and crossed the frozen dirt floor in 3 strides. Thomas was dead. His body was cold to the touch, frozen during the night despite being less than 12 feet from the fireplace. Lars stood there in the pre-dawn darkness, looking at his partner's body, trying to understand how this had happened. They had built the cabin the previous summer using standard mountain man techniques. Notched logs, mud chinking, a solid stone fireplace, a good roof. They had cut plenty of firewood. They had done everything right according to frontier wisdom. The fireplace had been burning when they went to sleep. Lars had fed it himself around midnight. But the cabin was roughly 16 feet by 20 feet, and a fireplace only heated the space directly in front of it. The far corners, where Thomas had chosen to sleep because he claimed he slept better away from the fire's light, had apparently dropped below survivable temperature during the deepest cold of the night. Lars built up the fire and sat beside it as dawn broke, unable to process what had happened. Thomas had survived 4 winters in the mountains. He was competent, experienced, careful. He had frozen to death 12 feet from a burning fire inside a cabin they had built to protect themselves from exactly this kind of danger. The realization that followed was simple and terrible. Their cabin, built like every other trapper's cabin in the territory, was a death trap during extreme cold. The fireplace created a sphere of warmth that extended perhaps 8 feet in any direction. Beyond that sphere, the temperature dropped precipitously. A man could freeze while his partner stayed warm, separated by nothing more than distance within the same 4 walls. Lars buried Thomas 2 days later on a hillside overlooking the river. The ground was frozen, and he had to build a fire on the burial site to thaw the earth enough to dig. It took an entire day. He marked the grave with stones and stood there as the sun set, thinking about the fundamental problem. Heat from a fire rose and concentrated near the source. It didn't distribute. It didn't circulate. A single fireplace in a frontier cabin created zones of survival and zones of death within the same structure. Most men would have accepted this as the cost of mountain life. Lars became obsessed with solving it. Lars spent the remainder of that winter alone in the cabin, maintaining trap lines and processing pelts mechanically while his mind worked on the problem of heat. He couldn't stop thinking about the temperature gradient he had measured by placing tin cups of water at various distances from the fireplace. The cup 6 feet away stayed liquid. The cup 12 feet away froze solid. The difference between life and death was measured in footsteps within a space meant to protect human life. But beneath the obsession with his immediate problem, an older memory kept surfacing. Lars had been born in Norway in 1808. His family had immigrated to America when he was 14, settling briefly in Wisconsin before Lars headed west at 20. The memories of Norway had faded over the years, but one remained vivid in a way he hadn't thought about in decades. His grandmother's house had warm floors. He remembered this clearly now, sitting alone through long winter nights. As a small child visiting her home in winter, he had played on floors that were somehow warm to the touch, even in rooms far from the fireplace. He remembered his grandmother saying something about stones beneath the house, about old ways of building that kept the whole home warm instead of just the room with the fire. He had been perhaps 6 years old and hadn't paid attention to the explanation. Now, 26 years later, he desperately wished he had listened. Lars had no technical drawings to reference, no books describing Scandinavian heating methods, no way to reconstruct what his grandmother's house had contained beneath its floors. But he had the memory of warmth spreading beyond a single source. He had the memory of heat that didn't concentrate in one spot. And he had winters of experience observing how heat behaved in frontier cabins, how it rose uselessly to empty ceiling space, how it failed to reach corners, how it created deadly cold zones within structures meant for survival. He began studying his current cabin with new attention. He watched smoke from the fireplace rise straight to the ceiling and pool there before gradually seeping out through gaps in the roof. Wasted heat. He placed his hand on the logs directly beside the fireplace. Warm. He walked 8 feet away and touched the wall. Cold. He looked at the dirt, floor, and imagined heat, somehow moving through it instead of rising away from it. The idea that formed was vague and probably impossible. What if heat could be distributed beneath the floor instead of rising above it? What if the floor itself could become the source of warmth instead of a cold surface that pulled heat from your feet? What if you could somehow create a system where fire warmed the foundation and that warmth radiated upward through the entire living space? Lars had no idea if such a thing was possible. He had no engineering training, no formal education in physics or thermodynamics. What he had was a dead partner, a memory of warm floors from childhood, and an obsession with solving a problem that killed men every winter across the frontier. Spring arrived in late March, 1841. The snow melted, the river rose, and trappers throughout the territory emerged from winter quarters to assess damage, make repairs, and prepare for the season's work. Lars sold his furs in the small trading settlement 30 miles downriver and returned with enough money to sustain himself through another year. But instead of spending the spring and summer trapping beaver, he began building a new cabin. The location he selected was 2 miles from where Thomas had died. High ground with good drainage, clear sight lines, and proximity to timber. He began by doing something no other mountain man in the territory had ever done. He started excavating before he started building. Using a shovel he had purchased at the trading post, Lars began digging trenches into the ground where his cabin floor would eventually sit. The trenches followed a specific pattern he had worked out during the late winter months. They ran in parallel lines spaced 3 feet apart, each trench approximately 1 foot wide and 2 feet deep. The trenches connected at the ends, creating a continuous pathway that would run beneath the entire floor space of the cabin. The pattern resembled a serpent coiling back and forth across the foundation area. Henry Caldwell was the first neighboring trapper to visit and witness what Lars was doing. Henry had a cabin 6 miles west and had known both Lars and Thomas for 3 years. He arrived in mid-April to find Lars waist-deep in excavated earth, digging with methodical intensity. Henry watched for several minutes before speaking. "You're putting ditches in your floor," Henry said. It wasn't a question, just an observation of something that made no sense. Lars kept digging. "Foundation trenches," he said without looking up. "For what purpose?" "Heat distribution." Henry stared at the network of trenches. "You planning to fill them with hot coals and walk on top?" "Stone-lined channels. Fire burns inside. Floor sits above." Henry laughed. It started as a chuckle and grew into genuine amusement. "Fire? In trenches? Under your floor? You're planning to burn yourself alive from underneath." Lars stopped digging and looked at Henry, directly. Thomas froze 12 feet from a burning fireplace. Single-source heat doesn't work in extreme cold. Need distributed warmth. "So you're digging fire ditches under your cabin." Henry shook his head. "Lars, fire belongs in a fireplace. Stone, clay, built proper. Not in trenches under wooden floors. You'll burn through the floor, or smoke yourself to death, or both." Lars returned to digging. "Stone will contain it. Ventilation will control it. Heat will radiate through floor instead of rising uselessly to ceiling." Henry watched for another minute, then left. By evening, word had spread through the scattered trapping community. The Norwegian who lost his partner over winter had gone mad. He was digging graves under his cabin. He was building fire pits beneath wooden floors. He was going to kill himself with his own foolishness before next winter arrived. Lars kept digging. The digging took 3 weeks. When Lars finished, he had a network of trenches covering the entire foundation footprint of what would become a 16 by 20-foot cabin. The trenches were precise, level, and connected in a continuous pathway that would allow heat to flow from one end of the system to the other. But empty trenches were useless. They needed to become channels, and channels required stone. Lars spent the next month at the river. He needed flat stones, uniform in thickness, large enough to provide structural integrity, but small enough to handle alone. He rejected rounded river rocks. He searched for stone that had fractured naturally into slabs, the kind of rock that split along predictable planes and could be shaped if necessary. He found a deposit of gray, slate-like stone 2 miles downstream and began hauling it back to his construction site. Each stone was carried individually. Lars would select a piece, carry it to the cabin site, and evaluate whether it fit his requirements. Stones that were too thick were discarded. Stones with irregular surfaces were set aside. He wanted stones between 2 and 4 inches thick with at least one flat surface. The hauling was backbreaking work. A usable stone weighed between 15 and 30 pounds. Lars made 40 trips each day for 28 days, moving over 1,000 individual stones from the river to his foundation. The actual construction of the stone-lined channels began in early June. Lars started at one end of the trench network and worked systematically toward the other. He placed stones vertically along both sides of each trench, creating walls that stood 18 inches high from the trench bottom. The walls needed to be stable without mortar, so he selected stones that nested together, using smaller pieces to fill gaps and create solid barriers. Between the stone walls, a channel 1 foot wide remained open. This channel would contain the fire. The stone walls would protect the earth and the wooden floor above from direct flame contact. Lars fitted each stone carefully, adjusting placement until the walls stood straight and stable. The work progressed slowly. A good day meant completing 8 feet of stone-lined channel. A difficult day meant half that. Henry Caldwell visited again in late June. He found Lars on his knees, fitting stones into trench walls with the concentration of a master craftsman working on cathedral construction. Henry dismounted and stood looking at the stone channels running in parallel lines across the excavated foundation. "You've actually done it," Henry said. "Built fire ditches lined with stone." "Heat channels," Lars corrected without stopping his work. "And you genuinely believe you can burn fire in these channels without the whole structure catching flame? Stone doesn't burn. Heat radiates upward. Smoke vents through chimney system. Floor stays intact." Henry shook his head slowly. "Every trapper within 30 miles thinks you've lost your mind. You know that?" Lars placed another stone, checked its stability, adjusted the fit. "They thought Thomas and I were fine last winter too. We had a proper fireplace, built right, burned all night." He still froze. The stone-lined channels were complete by mid-July, but Lars knew the system would fail without proper ventilation. Fire required oxygen to burn and produce smoke that needed to escape. A sealed channel would suffocate itself within minutes. An improperly vented channel would leak smoke upward through the floor, making the cabin uninhabitable. Lars needed to solve the engineering problem that would make or break his entire design. He started by building a traditional stone chimney at one end of the cabin foundation, but instead of connecting it to a fireplace, he extended the chimney base downward into the trench network. The final trench channel terminated directly beneath the chimney, creating an exhaust point where smoke could rise and exit the structure. The chimney would pull smoke from the entire channel system through natural draft, the same principle that made fireplaces draw properly. At the opposite end of the trench network, Lars created air intake vents. He built small stone-lined shafts that descended from ground level down into the first channel. These vents would allow fresh air to enter the system, feeding oxygen to the fire burning in the channels. He positioned the intake vents carefully, ensuring they would remain above snow level during winter and could be covered or opened to control airflow. The fuel loading system required different thinking. Lars couldn't remove the entire floor every time he needed to add wood to the channels. He designed access points at regular intervals along the trench network. These were square openings, 2 feet on each side, positioned every 8 feet. The openings would allow him to drop fuel into the channels and remove ash periodically. He would cover them with fitted stone caps during normal operation, and those caps would eventually be incorporated into the floor structure. Testing the system began in late July. Lars built a small fire in one section of channel using dry kindling and small branches. He watched carefully as smoke rose from the chimney and fresh air pulled through the intake vents. The draw was strong. The fire burned steadily. The stone walls grew warm but didn't crack or fail. After 2 hours of burning, Lars examined the channel thoroughly. The stone had blackened from smoke but remained structurally sound. No heat had transferred laterally into the surrounding earth beyond a few inches. Isaac Brennan, an older trapper who had spent 12 winters in the mountains, visited during one of these test burns. He watched smoke rising from the chimney while Lars knelt beside an open access point, observing the fire burning in the stone channel below ground level. "I'll grant you this," Isaac said. "The stone holds, fire burns, smoke vents properly. You've proven the channels work as channels." "That was the question," Lars said. "The question now is whether you'll cook yourself when you put a floor over top and trap the heat underneath. You're building an oven, Lars, with yourself as the contents." Lars looked at the warm stone walls, controlled heat, distributed evenly. That's survival, not cooking. The critical engineering challenge was calculating how much distance to leave between the burning channels and the wooden floor above. Too little space and the floor would scorch or ignite. Too much space and the heat wouldn't transfer effectively, defeating the entire purpose of the system. Lars had no tables or reference materials to consult. He had only observation and testing. He built a test section in early August. Using pine planks, he constructed a small platform 18 inches above one of the stone channels. He built a fire in the channel beneath and monitored the wood temperature over 6 hours of burning. The underside of the planks grew warm, but never hot enough to char. He reduced the distance to 12 inches and repeated the test. The wood grew hotter but still didn't reach dangerous temperatures. At 8 inches, the underside began to show heat stress after 4 hours of sustained fire. Lars settled on 12 inches of airspace between the top of the stone channel walls and the underside of the floor planks. The gap would allow heat to radiate upward while maintaining safe separation from open flame. Convection would carry warm air up through the gap, transferring heat to the floor without direct contact. The floor construction itself required precision. Lars cut pine logs into planks using a pit saw, the same technique he had learned working lumber camps in Wisconsin as a teenager. Each plank was roughly 8 feet long, 12 inches wide, and 2 inches thick. He shaped them to fit tightly together, creating a solid floor surface with minimal gaps. Gaps would leak heat, but more critically, they would allow smoke to seep into the living space if the ventilation system failed. He built a support structure using beams laid perpendicular to the channel network. These beams rested on the stone walls themselves, distributing the floor's weight across the entire foundation. The planks were laid across the beams and pegged in place using wooden dowels. The result was a floor that sat exactly 12 inches above the burning channels, supported entirely by the stone structure Lars had spent 3 months building. The access points required special attention. Lars created removable floor sections above each fuel loading opening. These sections were framed separately and could be lifted out completely, revealing the stone caps beneath. To add fuel, he would remove the floor section, remove the stone cap, drop wood into the channel, replace the cap, and replace the floor section. The process was more complex than simply throwing logs into a fireplace, but it allowed access to the entire channel network without compromising the floor's integrity. By late September, the cabin walls were up and the roof was complete. From outside, the structure looked like any other mountain man cabin. Notched logs, mud chinking, solid door, one window. But beneath the floor, hidden from view, ran a network of stone channels designed to turn the entire foundation into a heating system. Lars had spent 4 months building what most trappers built in 4 days. As autumn cold began creeping into the high country, he prepared to test whether his obsession had created survival or suicide. October 3, 1841. The morning air carried the bite of approaching winter. Lars stood inside his completed cabin, looking at the floor beneath his feet, knowing that everything he had built over the past 6 months would succeed or fail based on what happened in the next few hours. He had tested individual sections of the channel system, but he had never burned fire through the entire network with the floor sealed above it. He started at the intake end of the system. Removing a floor section and its stone cap, he built a small fire using dry pine kindling and cedar shavings. The kindling caught quickly. He added larger pieces, building the fire until flames rose 8 inches from the channel bottom. Smoke began flowing toward the chimney immediately, pulled by the natural draft. He replaced the stone cap and floor section, sealing the access point. Moving to the next access point 8 feet away, he repeated the process. More kindling, more wood, another fire burning in the channels, then the 3rd access point, then the 4th. By mid-morning, he had fires burning in 6 separate sections of the channel network. The chimney drew strongly, pulling smoke from all the connected channels. No smoke leaked through the floor. The system was breathing properly. Lars walked across the floor, testing each section. Above the burning channels, the planks were warm to the touch, but not hot. In the spaces between channels, the floor remained cooler. The heat was radiating upward exactly as he had calculated. He added more fuel through the access points, building the fires larger. The floor temperature increased gradually. After 2 hours of sustained burning, the entire floor surface had warmed to a temperature comfortable to stand on barefoot. Henry Caldwell arrived that afternoon, drawn by the unusual sight of smoke rising from Lars's chimney in a pattern that didn't match normal fireplace operation. The smoke was steady and controlled, not the variable flow of a hearth fire being fed and allowed to die down. Henry knocked and entered without waiting for response. The interior warmth hit him immediately. The cabin was genuinely warm, not just heated near a fireplace, but warm throughout the entire space. Henry looked around for the source. No fireplace along the walls. Just the chimney rising from the floor at one end. He looked down at the floor beneath his feet. "It's working," Henry said, more to himself than to Lars. "The floor radiates heat evenly. The channels distribute it. The ventilation controls it." Lars was standing in the center of the cabin in his shirt sleeves, despite the October cold outside. Henry walked across the floor slowly, feeling the warmth through his boot soles. "You actually did it. Built fire under your floor without burning the cabin down. The stone contains the flame. The air gap transfers the heat. The system maintains itself as long as fuel is added." Henry stood silent for a long moment, then walked to the door. Before leaving, he turned back. "Every man who called you foolish needs to see this." The first snows came in late October, light dustings that melted by afternoon. Lars burned small fires in his floor channels, learning the system's behavior. He discovered that the channels retained heat for hours after the fires died down. The stone absorbed thermal energy and released it slowly, maintaining floor warmth long into the night. A fire built at sunset would keep the floor comfortable until dawn. He experimented with fuel types. Pine burned hot and fast, requiring frequent additions. Oak and other hardwoods burned longer and more steadily. He learned that filling 3 or 4 channel sections with slow-burning hardwood provided better results than trying to maintain fire throughout the entire network. The stone conducted heat along its length, distributing warmth from active burn sections to cooler areas. By early November, word had spread through the trapping community about Lars's functional floor heating system. Trappers who had mocked the construction began stopping by to see it operate. Most arrived skeptical and left quiet. standing on warm floors inside a cabin with no visible fireplace, trying to reconcile what they were experiencing with what they understood about frontier heating. Robert Finch visited in mid-November. His cabin was built traditionally, with a large stone fireplace dominating one wall. He spent an hour in Lars's cabin, walking the floor, asking technical questions about fuel consumption and maintenance. Lars showed him the access points, explained the ventilation principle, described the stone channel construction. Robert listened carefully but made no commitment to adopting the technique himself. December brought serious cold. Temperatures dropped below zero and stayed there for days at a time. Trappers throughout the territory began burning through their firewood stockpiles at alarming rates. A traditional fireplace required constant feeding to maintain heat in the area immediately surrounding it. The rest of the cabin remained dangerously cold. Men slept in layers of furs and blankets, often waking multiple times during the night to rebuild fires. Lars burned approximately one-third the firewood his neighbors used. His floor channel system required fuel twice daily, morning and evening. The thermal mass of the stone retained enough heat between feedings to keep the cabin comfortable throughout the day and survivable through the night. He slept without excessive layers, walked barefoot on warm floors, and maintained a living space that stayed above freezing in all corners, even during the coldest nights. Isaac Brennan stopped by in late December during a particularly bitter cold snap. He found Lars sitting at a small table near the window, working on trap repairs in his shirt sleeves. Isaac stood just inside the door, still wearing his heavy fur coat. "It's warmer in here than in my cabin with the fireplace roaring," Isaac said. Lars looked up from his work. "The floor distributes heat everywhere. Fireplaces concentrated in one spot and send most of it up the chimney. How much wood did you burn today?" "2 loads, morning and evening." "I've burned 6 loads since dawn, just to keep from freezing." Isaac looked down at the floor beneath his boots. "Show me how you built this." The blizzard began on January 18, 1842. The temperature plummeted to 30 below, zero, before the snow even started falling. When the snow came, it came horizontally, driven by winds that made standing upright outside nearly impossible. The storm lasted 3 days and 2 nights without pause. It was the kind of weather that killed unprepared men and tested the limits of even well-built shelters. Lars spent the first day of the storm sealing every gap in his cabin. He packed additional clay into the chinking between logs and covered his single window with an extra layer of canvas. Then he loaded all 6 accessible sections of his floor channels with hardwood and settled in to wait out the storm. The fires burned steadily, the stone absorbed and radiated heat, and the cabin remained warm enough that Lars never put on his heavy coat. 2 miles away, Robert Finch was fighting for survival. His fireplace consumed wood at an unsustainable rate. The extreme cold and wind created downdrafts that fought the chimney's draw, filling his cabin with smoke periodically. He burned through 2 days of firewood in the first 12 hours. The areas of his cabin away from the fireplace dropped below freezing. Water in a cup placed 10 feet from the hearth turned to ice. Robert spent the storm huddled within 5 feet of the fireplace, feeding it constantly, wrapped in every fur and blanket he owned. Henry Caldwell fared slightly better, but still suffered. His fireplace was well built, and his firewood supply was substantial, but the constant feeding required to maintain survivable heat exhausted him. He slept in short intervals, waking every few hours to rebuild the fire. By the second night, he was burning furniture and tools, having depleted his accessible firewood and being unable to reach his outdoor supply through the storm. On the 3rd day, the wind finally stopped. The snow continued lightly, but the worst had passed. The temperature remained brutally cold, but the immediate crisis was over. Lars opened his door to find snow drifted 4 feet high against the north wall of his cabin. The sky was clearing. He looked toward the chimney and saw thin smoke still rising from the channel system below. The fires had burned through the entire storm without failing. Robert Finch appeared at Lars's door that afternoon, half frozen despite the storm being over. He had run out of firewood completely, and his fireplace had died. The interior of his cabin was below zero. He couldn't restart his fire because his hands were too cold to work the flint and steel. Lars brought him inside, sat him on the warm floor, and gave him hot food. Robert sat there for 20 minutes without speaking, just absorbing heat through the soles of his boots and the seat of his trousers. Finally, Robert looked at Lars. "I need you to teach me how to build this. Not next year. Not when spring comes. As soon as this cold breaks enough to dig, I need you to show me everything." Spring of 1842 arrived late. The snow didn't fully melt until mid-April, when the ground finally thawed enough to work. Robert Finch began digging trenches in the foundation of a new cabin. Lars spent 2 weeks showing him the technique. Trench spacing, stone selection, channel construction, ventilation design, floor installation. Robert listened with the intensity of a man who had nearly frozen to death and refused to face that possibility again. Henry Caldwell waited until May to begin his own floor channel system. He had spent the late winter visiting Lars repeatedly, asking detailed questions, sketching diagrams on birch bark. Henry's implementation was slightly different from Lars's original design. He used narrower channels spaced closer together, believing it would distribute heat more evenly. The modification worked. By the following winter, Henry's cabin stayed as warm as Lars's, with even less firewood consumption. Isaac Brennan was older and more cautious. He didn't rebuild his entire cabin, but instead added a limited channel system to one section of his existing structure. He dug trenches along one wall, lined them with stone, and installed a small section of heated floor near his sleeping area. The partial system proved that the concept worked on any scale. Even a few feet of heated floor changed the survivability of a space during extreme cold. Word spread beyond the immediate trapping community. Traders passing through the territory carried stories of cabins with warm floors and invisible heating systems. Some listeners dismissed the accounts as frontier exaggeration. Others paid attention. By 1844, variations of floor channel heating appeared in remote cabins across the northern Rockies. The specific designs differed based on available materials and individual skill, but the principle remained constant. Stone-lined channels beneath the floor, fire contained and controlled, heat distributed through thermal mass and radiation. Lars himself left the mountains in 1845. The fur trade was collapsing as beaver populations declined and market demand shifted. He had saved money during his trapping years and used it to purchase land in the Bitterroot Valley. He built a house there using the same floor heating principle he had developed, though scaled larger and refined with years of experience. He married in 1847, raised 4 children, and lived quietly until his death in 1873 at the age of 65. The technique he developed outlived him by decades. Trappers, hunters, and eventually homesteaders continued building cabins with underfloor heating systems well into the 1860s and 70s. Some of these structures survived into the 20th century. Historians documenting frontier construction methods occasionally encountered them and noted the sophisticated engineering, usually without knowing the origin story. Lars Ericsson never promoted his innovation or claimed credit for it. He had solved a problem that killed his partner. He had shared the solution with anyone who asked. The legacy he left wasn't fame or recognition, it was warmth. Built into foundations across the frontier, hidden beneath floors, burning steady through winter storms. Silent testament to what necessity, memory, and obsessive determination could accomplish when a man refused to accept that freezing 12 feet from a fire was simply the cost of mountain survival.